transitioning to your first career in public health. So with that, Aneeka, if you want to go ahead and kind of share out, maybe introduce yourself a little bit as well.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much, Olivia. So my name is Aneeka. I am a PhD student right now at Tulane, but I did my Master's of Science in Public Health at Hopkins and actually did my BA at Hopkins in Public Health as well. A little bit about me. So I did social and behavioral interventions as the program. And then from there, I went on to work at a small nonprofit called Inside Out, which is located in Baltimore. And so really what I just wanted to talk to y'all about today is kind of that like first transition from your master's in public health to working in nonprofit in this area. And really just kind of go over like, what were the things that like I maybe didn't expect or that I had to learn on the job and like where public health kind of came into it. So yeah, that's kind of the gist of it. Next slide, please. So yeah, as I said, I want to first kind of contextualize it with my Hopkins experience, which I would assume is perhaps different to yours because I did graduate in December of 2019, so before everything kind of shifted. And then go on to sort of talk to you about the skills that I learned while working in this field that maybe I wasn't expecting to pick up, or just like things that kind of surprised me, if you will. I then wanted to just go on and talk about like how I'm involved now with this nonprofit and sort of how both the organization evolved and how kind of my understanding and like connection to work in this field has evolved. And then finally, just like some advice given like the present context and things like that. Next slide, please. Also feel free to like interrupt with questions or like put questions in the chat. I can't really see the chat, but we'll sort of. So as I said, I did an MSPH in social and behavioral interventions, and I started in August of 2018 and finished in December of 2019. So again, like things in public health looked different to the way that things in public health look now, obviously. But what you see to the left on this slide is a book called Global Health by Mark Nichter. And it was like if anyone else is an SBI, you know this, but like when you do the program, you have to do a seminar at lunch each of the 4 quarters. And it was like our first quarter seminar was talking about this book, and we would read a chapter every week and talk about it. And the reason I bring it up is because it kind of underlies the way in which I think about nonprofit work in a lot of ways. It's a great book, would recommend in general. But what I really am getting at here is that the author talks a lot about how like we really need to kind of work beyond just like cultural competency and cultural humility into kind of this like very complex and like multifaceted dynamic understanding of how we relate to people, individuals, cultures that are not our own, and how that kind of intersects with health. And it's something that I think I've really taken with me. I work more in epidemiology now than I did when I was in my master's, but nonetheless, like I think it's something that I feel is really important when we're approaching public health because we have so many skills. You all are going to graduate with so much knowledge and so many skills in this area, but also at the same time, I think the difficulty is that we don't always know the communities that we're working in. And even if they might feel very proximal to us, like even if we're working in the same city that we've lived in, we don't necessarily have a connection to those immediate communities. And I think that's really, really important. And it's something that I feel that we are beginning to recognize more in the field, but that still we could possibly be doing work on to kind of, I don't know, better anticipate needs and challenges, and also just better kind of integrate our field into like where it sits within culture and within community. So that's why I bring this up. That was kind of like the grounding I think that I brought into my nonprofit work. And then next slide, please. Oh, sorry. Thank you. And so from there, I got to do a practicum in Sri Lanka. So my family is are all Sri Lankan. My parents were born there. I'm a citizen, but I grew up in Canada. And why I think this matters is because for me, going there was like going to a second home. Like I got to stay with my aunts and uncles. The pictures top right and bottom left are my uncle's dogs. He actually had 6 dogs, but I couldn't get them all in one picture. And top bottom right was when I was staying with one of my cousins. Top left is when I was staying with another uncle. So a lot of fun. But I think it's very different to work in a context that's very close to you. And then what this was especially, I think, interesting for me was by contrast when I worked in when I had traveled to Guinea the previous summer under the Global Health Established Field Placement. I was going to a country where I was obviously not familiar with the cultural context, and it wasn't like my personal background. And so doing this practicum in Sri Lanka, I worked on programming around substance use for like kindergarten through grade 12 students or like the equivalent. And I think it was I found it like a lot easier to kind of know some of the nuances. Obviously, I haven't lived in Sri Lanka extensively, but still just having that background and familiarity was really, really helpful. And that was another piece. So then I knew when I eventually started working, or shortly thereafter started working, that I wanted to be in a field where I felt like if it wasn't me who had that proximity, like I was being guided and led by folks who had that proximity to the communities we were working in. Felt like something that was really important to me. It's like that it would be a better fit. And so next slide, please. So I landed at Inside Out after that. So I graduated in December and I started working pretty shortly thereafter for Inside Out. And so what Inside Out is it's a nonprofit based in Baltimore. And we do programming around like sustainable nutrition and movement. And so what I mean by that is obviously we know that there's a lot of predictors of cardiometabolic diseases. And amongst them are nutrition and movement. And drivers of those things are also very, very complex. There's a whole lot of structural determinants. There's also genetic determinants, and I believe that structural determinants could be changed, but obviously genetic cannot. But there's a lot of factors that kind of mediate those as well. So like beyond only structural, there are also community level factors, including like social norms, self-efficacy, things like that around some of these behaviors. And so what our organization aims to do is kind of see if we can sustainably promote like small behavioral changes at mostly the individual to community level. And so it's things like, making the adoption of some of these behaviors cool, things like that, just like socially accepted amongst students. And now we're even expanding to sort of broader like wellness programming for students of all like school ages. So not just K-8, but now going up to grade 12 as well. And what drew me to this organization was really that I felt like they were so just well integrated into the community, and there was a clear desire and want by the folks they were working with for their programming. So when I first spoke with the executive director, whose name is Renata, that was like one of the first things she told me. She was like, there are a lot of schools that reach out to me and they like our program and they want us to come in, but we have to find a way to like be able to deliver this sustainably to more people. And I thought that was really like, that just really kind of struck that same chord that I was talking about during my practicum, because it felt like, I could be a part of an organization that not only valued, but that really was like part of the community, as opposed to sort of sitting like aside from it and then trying to intervene. I felt like that was an important distinction. And I also felt like I could make an important contribution, because what I was coming in with I was not the person who was going to be like proximal or have that kind of lived experience knowledge. I was bringing in more like, okay, how do we like research and implement and evaluate a program? Like those are the skills that I had. Those are skills that I had from my degree. And I felt like it was a good match to have those things come together and really just hopefully like help continue to push this program forward. What I didn't expect though is that there was a lot more that went into my work than just like doing public health. And so next slide, please. So the fun and interesting part of doing all this is that I was working at it was a relatively small organization. It's definitely grown and our reach has grown. But at the time, there weren't a whole lot of people working for Inside Out. And so suddenly I was like thrown into or took on a lot of roles that were even more so than what I'd imagined. So some of the examples I have on here, I helped coordinate the website redevelopment. So like the picture I showed you on the previous slide, that's a screenshot of the website. I think it looks pretty. I'm definitely biased. But like that was something I'd never done. I'm not like a CS person. I don't know how to do that. But it was really cool to kind of work with a web designer and get to do that. I also was able to interview and hire folks. As I said, we were kind of at that like crucial moment of like, we have this establishment and we know what we want to do. And there are people who want us to keep doing it for them, but we needed to grow to be able to do that. So I was involved in the interviewing and hiring process. And then I was it actually got to a point where I was managing a small team too. And then there were also just kind of like skills that like maybe I didn't think that I needed to gain, but that I did gain. So like, for example, I would cold call folks working in Baltimore City, like planning office, sustainability, things like that, just to like understand what their programs were, what was going on. And for context, I started working, as I said, like January 2020, and I was working for them as COVID hit. So, also just to try to figure out like, okay, what are we doing about like school lunches? Where can students get food? Like, what is the information that we can relay to families, like even beyond just kind of our programming, but simply because we had that like community buy-in, and because we were a group that folks looked to answer some of these questions. And so with that too came like communicating science to this more general audience, which I also found extremely interesting. But it was this new challenge that I'd never really thought of because I'd been so focused on like doing academics for, I suppose, the sake of academics, or like research for the sake of research. That really like not just getting to the point where, okay, I've like had my finding and I have my conclusion, but like now how do I explain that to someone who maybe doesn't have a background in science or like a heavy background in public health? And make it not just explain it, but explain it in a way that it's interesting and they want to like, spend time like focusing on that. The other piece I had to like, other skill was obviously social media, which I feel like now is just becoming like another way that we do science communication, which is again super interesting, but like also a challenge. So the reason that I bring this up is I think something that I've noticed is depending on the size of a nonprofit or a company in general, your roles might be very, very different. And I think that's a really exciting opportunity to kind of learn more and to get to try things that are maybe newer outside the box. The caveat that I will give with this, that I always give, is that at no point did I want to step into a role and say like, hey, I am now an expert at this for something that I was not an expert in. And so I think that's like a really interesting line to walk, or at least it was for me, where I want to like give my best and do things that I know there's a need for if I have the capacity to do it, even if it's slightly outside of my scope of like things that I had previously done. But at the same time, I'm not going to present myself as an expert for something I'm not an expert in. I think that's very, very important when we talk about like trust and things like that. Next slide, please. There were also obviously contextual factors. So as I said, I was like starting in January 2020 and then March 2020 hit. And so there was obviously COVID, but I think it's also very, very important to recognize that there was a lot of like labor being asked of communities of color, and particularly of the Black community in June of 2020. And I think it's important to recognize that in the context of working for an NGO that was predominantly, of which our CEO is a Black woman from Baltimore, and the majority of the staff are Black women. So it was a really important context. I felt like it was important to bring this up because we in public health don't work in a bubble. And I think that's become super, super obvious with COVID. Like, obviously, we take COVID into account when we're doing things because we have to. But beyond that, just understanding like the social factors of public health. I think like I feel like public health is kind of social justice in a lot of ways, or it's a way to achieve social justice or an element of it. And I think like you can't, no matter how specific your mission is, no matter how specific like the scope of work of any nonprofit organization is, I think we can't just ignore those contextual factors. And that was something that felt very important to me at the time, to make sure that like whatever I was doing, like I was firstly not causing harm, even if like in any context, like regardless of intention, regardless of like goals, things like that had to be kind of the priority. And that also just, I suppose, gave me a lot of perspective in like what I wanted to do. And again, like it kind of reaffirmed that idea of like when we're working with organizations and communities of which like we are not a member of that community, just the inherent dynamics, the inherent like power dynamics, things like that, that are, I think, really important to make sure that we're keeping in mind. And so moving on from that, I just wanted to touch on like some of the skills that I guess I used from Hopkins. Next slide, please. Thank you. So some of those, as I said, like we talked about cultural competency, humility, and kind of going beyond that in that like global health seminar and also beyond. We talked about it a whole lot. I took formative research, talked about how to kind of understand how to integrate like a program in a way that it's acceptable, interesting, useful to different communities. And just applying those skills, even in a domestic context, I think was so, so valuable, because ultimately you can't translate a program, even if it works at one school, maybe to another. Like that amount of, there's differences between every single place, every single community, every single group. And so keeping that in mind, I think was incredibly important and really a helpful framework to work through. And to use to kind of understand like where the sort of programming fits, and then where like we have to bring in like the cultural and community level factors. I obviously spent a lot of time in the literature looking at like how to develop these programs, like what were best practices, what were recommendations, things like that. But again, like making sure that it's, evidence-based plus culturally relevant. And then we used qualitative and quantitative methods, both in generally kind of in like program assessment. So as we were going, we would use like key informant interviews to like help develop the programs. And then we would use key informant interviews and focus groups to evaluate it. We used surveys to kind of gauge what people wanted, and similarly like post surveys to gauge what they had taken away, things like that. And then that kind of ties into like program evaluation and improvement, all of which are like very much kind of those were like the hands-on public health skills. And so I think in this context, they are very easily applicable, kind of very directly applicable, which makes a lot of sense. But I think there is such a difference doing it in the context of like actually working on like a real program as opposed to maybe doing it in an academic context. I think that's important, again, because like all of us are imperfect human beings, but we have this duty to like not only, benefit whatever group that we're like working to support, but also just ultimately to not cause harm. And so doing things like consistently with this like very kind of critical lens about like what are the biases, what are the powers, what are like the ways in which I'm potentially like perpetuating systems of oppression at the same time as like doing any activity, I think are so incredibly important. And that was really like sort of key to the way that I thought about the work in this context. And so next slide, please. So these are some of the achievements. I don't mean to say that these are my achievements, but these are some of the things that we were able to do, which I thought were really exciting. And especially like, again, given like the sudden shift during COVID, and just recognizing that again, like we wanted to continue to support communities that were experiencing like, I mean, everyone was experiencing a pandemic that was completely unprecedented. And so like reworking and figuring out how to leverage like community resources and then still do so like with all the constraints placed upon us was very, very challenging. So despite it all, we were able to actually increase the program reach. We transitioned from in-person to totally virtual programming. And now we're sort of resuming some of the in-person, but again, like as we all know, things change all the time. We did an external qualitative evaluation. That meant to say internal, not interval, I'm sorry. An internal qualitative program evaluation and an external quantitative evaluation. And then finally, as I mentioned, I think earlier, we are also in the process of developing and piloting additional programs for middle and high schoolers. So again, like these are, I think, again, not my achievements at all, but just things I think that are important, like when you kind of bring together that there's all those like critical lenses and you apply both the public health framework and that kind of critical lens to the work you're doing, and you have like not only community buy-in, but like the majority of people who work at Inside Out are very much like from the community, and like have those connections. I think that's when you can kind of like bring programs forward and sort of push public health forward in a way too. And next slide, please. So I'm still involved with Inside Out. As I mentioned, I'm now doing my PhD, so I'm not working there like full time, but I do volunteer as an advisor, and that's been a really cool role to step into because it's a little different than doing like the day to day, but rather I get to step back and kind of look at like what we did, where we are now, and like where we want to go, and sort of see how I can like bring anything to support that. So some of those things include like developing and supporting the public health team with their evidence-based programming. So just continuing to make sure, you know, we're always up to date, like we're always responsive to how things are changing, but also like we want to make sure that we're always being like mindful of, again, like sort of intersectionality and the potential for negative impact. So as an example, as I said, we work in the space of kind of like food related and movement related interventions. And when you're working on like cardiometabolic diseases through the life course, there is the potential to bring in like negative harms. And so an example is obviously like fat phobia, which is not at all something that we're gonna, like we're always gonna steer, not only just try to not promote, but like actively counter, right? And so making sure that not only are we evidence-based, but we're really like always at the forefront of trying to make sure that in no way we are causing harm. And we're being really mindful of like where factors like systems of oppression intersect and could affect our work. I also work with some students at both the School of Public Health and the School of Medicine, which is super fun. And so we're working on a couple of different projects. It's really, really cool to be able to bring like Inside Out, help Inside Out work with Source, if y'all are familiar with Source. And it's just been interesting, I think, to like be able to be one of a number of preceptors for some of the students and just kind of share my experiences there. I still work pretty like heavily in grant development because when you work in nonprofits, you write a lot of grants. And then I support just like generally kind of program development for like our newer programs too. And next slide, please. So I think this is where I'm kind of gonna like transition to sort of what I like more general thoughts about this sector and kind of where we are. I think something that I've noticed, so I have like I've worked with Inside Out, but I've worked with a couple of other nonprofits as well here and there. And something I've found is that there's definitely like starting to be a greater amount of accountability and emphasis around this idea of like neocolonialism, power dynamics, systems of oppression, and how like the idea of simply like doing good um, is not always as like simple as it seems. And I think it's really important that we're like getting to a point where we're really actively recognizing it and we're trying to like work through and dismantle some of those structural powers. But obviously, like we can continue to go further there. I also think there has been a greater interest in public health. My understanding is like the number of applicants to public health schools has absolutely skyrocketed in the last couple of years. But generally speaking, like if you tell someone, hey, I'm a student of public health, they're like, oh, cool, I know exactly what that means. Whereas I feel like a few years ago when I said, hey, I think I want to be like a social epidemiologist, people were like, those, I don't know what that means. And I think it's sort of interesting when you have this like investment in buy-in where like you could potentially like do more with it. But obviously there's still challenges. So even though I think the interest has gone up, it seems like in a lot of domains funding has not increased to match that. And that's certainly a challenge depending on like, especially depending on the space that we're working in. We are obviously navigating COVID-19. So I talked a little bit about like how my practicum in Sri Lanka like really impacted where I wanted to work and things like that. But I know that that's like not, I don't know if y'all are able to do your practicum this summer for those of you who have that as part of your program, but like I know that that's certainly a challenge right now. It does seem like, again, there's more individuals who potentially want to transition into public health. And then I think like brings its challenges in of itself, like even though there's more interest, like again, we need to ensure that the ways in which we're working are not only sustainable, but like inherently not harmful. And of course, there's still like problematic dynamics that remain. So what do we do with these? Next slide, please. I also just think this picture is really fun. If you look at it, it sort of shows where like public health is. But for you all, I think this could mean a lot of things. Firstly, there's obviously, arguably room to carve out like a space in public health that matters to you. And I think that's really exciting in a lot of ways. I hope that we are reframing the way we think about nonprofits, public health, social justice, and how those all come together. And so hopefully if there's something that you're super passionate about, there is an organization out there doing that work and doing it perhaps through a public health lens, or at least willing to do it through a public health lens. I also think that this provides an excellent opportunity to bring those like public health research and sort of like evidence-based skills into a nonprofit. And just kind of more broadly, like reimagine how public health could be social justice. There's a great article in The Atlantic by Ed Young, if that's something like if you're curious about like the intersection there. And finally, last slide, please. So on that, I guess like the advice I would give to you is not to limit yourself in your scope of work, like explore things that are interesting to you, explore areas that maybe like don't immediately seem like public health if they're what are interesting to you, but also like be aware of what you present as your expertise versus like what is not. And what I mean by that especially is I firmly am of the belief that there's no amount of like academic knowledge that can replace experiential knowledge. Like I can never enter a community that is not my community and expect that I understand the lived experience of people who have had a different lived experience than me. And sometimes I feel like there's maybe, I think that we have sometimes a desire to like use academic knowledge to try to replace that. And I think it's really critical that we draw the line in like what we know and what we're able to do as like skilled professionals, and like where we still need to incorporate lived experiences and like kind of like lived knowledge into our work, because those two things go together. And I don't think one works. I don't think public health works without that lived experience upon it. I would also strongly recommend that if you want to go into the nonprofit sector, you do your research. There's a whole lot of nonprofits out there doing amazing, amazing work. Um, and one piece of advice that I was given was like, look up the history of your nonprofit that you're interested in working in. Um, that's, but also recognize that, you know, firms are able to evolve and change. And obviously, like, no single organization is going to be perfect. But I think it's really important to strike a balance there. And you don't necessarily want to work for someone that, or for an organization that doesn't embody the same values as you do. Um, and then my kind of experience is super specific because I worked in a very small, for the like majority, or what I've been talking about largely, is like a pretty small domestic nonprofit. And I love that because I got to do so many things that were, as I said, like across so many different areas at times. But that's going to be really different if you're working at a really large nonprofit. It's also going to be different if you're working internationally versus domestically, I think. And by that, I mean like whatever is, you know, your home country versus like working abroad from there. And then overall, just like, I think it's important to also enjoy it. I think this is really interesting work because at least in my mind, because I got to work with so many people and learn from them. And I found it really important to use that to kind of build relationships. I talk to our like executive director all the time. We were talking yesterday about COVID stuff, and it's been like an incredible experience for me to still maintain that relationship with her and just be able to kind of continue to learn from her and seek advice from her. And so I would just strongly recommend that, like, you know, I think a first career doesn't have to be like your forever career. It can be if you want, but it doesn't have to be. And so I hope though that like that doesn't mean that, you know, you leave it and don't talk to anyone ever again. I think it can be a wonderful way to like build relationships, meet people, and just learn from those around you. So that's all I had. I put my email on the next slide if y'all have any specific questions. But yeah, I'm happy to take any questions now.
So feel free if you do have questions, you can put them in the chat. And then also you should be able to come off of mute right now and just share out and answer your questions if you have them. So I'll go ahead and get us started. You mentioned the skills that you gained from Inside Out. Can you share the specific like public health skills you learned from your practicum experience?
For my practicum experience, I think it was really solidifying this like lit review into like program skills, if that makes sense. So what I was doing is really like compiling evidence for best practices around developing substance use programming for like school age children. So it was a lot of kind of, here is what the research says. Like, there was pretty limited research in the Sri Lankan context, just because Sri Lanka has like very strong laws around substances. And so what was interesting there is saying like, okay, here is what the research in like other countries says. And so here is where we kind of need to like supplant that with local evidence, like whether that's, you know, doing like focus groups or things like that. And so sort of building that framework for them to then like go forward and do like key informant interviews and stuff like that. Those were kind of, I think, the biggest skills.
Thank you. And so that definitely kind of fed into your desire to work at Inside Out and specifically like with nonprofits, right? You had also spoke about some of the challenges with working for a nonprofit. Can you share some of the most like enjoyable components of this work? It seems like it's very close to your heart and like what you enjoy doing. So I just would love to hear about like, you know, what is something that it's like a shining moment or shining moments for you?
I think my favorite parts are just like seeing, just like talking to people and like hearing about the impact. I also like, I think it's really fun to like work with children in general. Like I think it's an interesting part of public health. And so it's just really fun to like hear stories like our health educators would come back and say like, oh, you know, this student in our class like got so excited to show me that they had like a reusable water bottle and they were filling it up like 2 or 3 times a day, and they were just like so jazzed about that. And so I think like that's kind of the fun part about, especially like at the scale that we're at, like we, you know, everyone knows like what's going on with everyone else. So we always kind of knew like if, you know, someone had had a really great day, they'd had a really great session with a class, they'd gotten really great feedback, just like hearing that. And like presently I'm involved with one of our pilot programs. And so it's really, I just like sit there muted, camera off as like an observer to see how it's going. But it's really fun too to just like hear the students get engaged, and when they're like going back and forth on a topic and they're like super super excited about it, they want to learn more, they're having really great feedback. Like I think it's just fun to kind of see, okay, like I worked on, you know, I supported this part of it, like our team worked on getting all of the evidence and then going through like these refining processes with different like stakeholders and groups, and then we got to this pilot program and now we get to actually like do it and see the response. And I think that's the moment for me where it's like, okay, they're excited about it, and like this is, you know, it's making some sort of impact on them, they're thinking about it. Maybe this was like, you know, for whatever way it maybe shapes some outcome. I just think that's like really the fun bit of it.
That is beautiful. So it sounds like it's really those full circle moments. And just being able to kind of see all that hard work that you put in and seeing it kind of come back twofold, really. So with that, can you share how your experience in the nonprofit sector has impacted your approach to public health overall?
I think like the biggest thing is like I this is gonna sound really bizarre, but like both taking myself entirely out of it and also like understanding that I can never do that. And what I mean by that is like whatever I put into any project or like whatever research I do, whatever like, you know, evaluation framework I'm going through, like it's not about me. Um it's, you know, like our end goal is so much bigger than kind of like whatever impact or things like that. But at the same time, like I will, no matter how hard I try, I will always bring a certain perspective and certain biases. And like the way that I even understand knowledge is through, sounds like very silly, but like it's through myself. Like I can't separate who I am as a human being from the work I do. And that's been like, I think the approach that I try to take to all of public health is recognizing like there are inherently, you know, certain privileges that I bring to the table, certain experiences, certain ways in which I relate to people that have power in them that I like. And because of like the system that we live in, I can't entirely disentangle that myself, but I can be aware of it and I can try my best to like minimize the harm that I'm doing because of potentially like the systemic powers that I carry. And I think that's been like, I think it's a little more obvious when you're working kind of directly um, with folks who are from like, you know, a community that's different than yours when you're entering into a space that's not yours. But I think that's something that I try to think about like in public health generally, even if I'm doing like, you know, 1,000-person data analysis on something like where I'm never going to meet those people. I'm not like collecting that data. It exists, it's de-identified. Even then, I think thinking about the ways in which like, how am I presenting this? How am I framing it? Am I like accidentally or inadvertently like creating a system where I'm further reinforcing some negative stereotype or something? Like, am I doing something that will cause harm? And I think that's been like a really key moment of doing this work is just spending time like being reflexive and thinking about like what is it that I'm bringing to the table, all of the good but also all of the bad, and all of those like systems that we all carry with us, and how can I like be mindful of that and try to work around it, or like when I can't, bring people in who have that like lived knowledge so that they can like help kind of facilitate the process, if that makes sense.
It does. So thank you so much for touching on that, not even just now, but throughout your presentation, really kind of looking at the social justice and cultural competency factors of this work and what that means. I think in public health overall, there are so many different areas of people's lives that you end up impacting. So it is definitely something that you want to do regularly, is have that reflection and kind of considering not just yourself, as you said, stepping back, but the lived experiences of others. So I really appreciate you sharing that. It looks like we do have a comment in the chat. So how do you build rapport and trust with people from different backgrounds when working with communities?
I think it totally depends. So like as an example, when I worked for a while in Canada, which is where I'm from, and I like worked with mostly we worked on like a longitudinal study around men who were living with HIV. And like in that context, I'm Canadian, they're Canadian. Like we have a lot of shared things in common. We both live in like the same city, but obviously there are certain aspects of like their lived experience that I don't have. And so it's like there I'm going to approach certain things like we can, build rapport because we like the same restaurant, like whatever, little things versus like say in Sri Lanka, like I have certain things in common. Like I've, a group with the same culture, like all the same foods, like, I'm super excited when like we get to go and like have, just like share a meal, like when someone invites you to their house, things like that. But also like as I said, being Canadian, like I didn't grow up there. So like there are things that like maybe I'm not gonna understand. So I think it's like really situational. And then obviously like if I'm in a context where like I'm entirely just like I'm not from the community, like I don't have kind of those like specific ties, then I think it's really different. And so with each of those like situations, I try to approach it in a way where I'm like, okay, what am I like, who am I? Like, what am I bringing? Do I have like structural power over the people that I'm working with? If so, how can I like try to, I can't ever like necessarily minimize that structural power, but like how do I work in a way where I'm ensuring that I'm not like using it to minimize like the impact that they can have. So I know that's like kind of not an answer, but I think it's super, super, super depends. So in some contexts, I think that's like really getting buy-in from folks who um who have like a closer buy-in, if that makes sense. So for example, like when we were doing work in Guinea, we worked with a university, and so like some of the professors at Hopkins knew the professors at that university, and that was like the point of connection. And so, we like worked with them, and then we met their students, and then like their students were able to kind of, I mean, the students were the ones like doing all the data collection, so that like there was kind of that influence there. But like then you kind of build those relationships and you go on and you like network outwards from there. Whereas like in context where maybe I have a little bit more familiarity or like close proximity to the community, I think then it's just going to be a different situation where I might be able to sit down with someone who like I don't immediately know or like have a connection to and just have that like natural, like sort of lived experience connection. So I think it's always like the point that I started is like what's my positionality relative to the community that I'm working with, and how can that positionality cause harm, and how can I try to minimize that. I think that's my starting point, and then going from there, sort of in each context it's going to be highly, highly different, but that's kind of like the ultimate goal, is to like understand where I'm positioned relative to like who I'm working with, if that makes sense.
Thank you. That was a really good question, and we have many thanks in the chat for you sharing your experiences overall. So I have one last question for you, and it's actually kind of a great segue from what was just asked. And thinking about a lot of these powerful words and phrases that you are kind of bringing into the conversation here, like that structural power, right? The lived experiences. How would you say that you might have prepared for these kind of socioeconomic factors that tie into nonprofit work And maybe if there wasn't necessarily a process of preparing, how would you recommend to students from your experience that, they kind of look at the fact that it's not just public health, but there are some components of like, socioeconomic areas as well.
Yeah. I think like the biggest one is to talk about it. Like I spoke out with, our like folks working with me with our ED about like social justice, things like that. But I think we have like I feel like public health sometimes wants to just be removed from that, like wants to be this like objective science, which like I know that public health is science, but like we are still tied into social justice. And I think a huge thing is just to say it. Like to ask, like what are we doing to understand, to explore, to be cognizant, like to recognize all these factors. I think that's so important because not talking about it isn't going to make it go away. And also not realizing like there's one piece. So one piece is that I think we like to distance ourselves, and the other thing that I think the field in general of public health likes to do is to say like we are at a net neutral. Like if we're coming into this work and we personally have not like caused harm, then we are at zero. Like we're good, we're neutral. But I think that's not true because we carry with us like a certain legacy, as do like all people, right? Like we all are a product of our environments and our history and our legacies. And so there's no way to like distance ourselves from that without admitting it. So like I think that those are the two pieces are like, okay, so what is it like, what are we doing to, work on social justice? Like how do we promote social justice? And honestly, just asking that of like your supervisor, of the people you're interviewing for, if you're looking for work, like I know that might sound like incredibly bold, but if you get a response that doesn't equate with your values, maybe that's not the right fit for you. But if you get a response that really does, like then right? Like then that what you're working for is like something that is aligned with your values and what you want to do. And then the next piece is also just taking some time to recognize, okay, like what is the history of this organization? What is the history of like, the kind of general ways in which like organizations have worked with this community in the past, and recognizing how that might be involved. Like as an example, so when I was in Guinea in 2018. So that was 4 years after the Ebola outbreak of 2014. And the specific organization I was working with had not like been involved in that response heavily, but that was still something that we had to keep in mind because there had been like huge amounts of mistrust sown during that period due to like numerous factors that had come into play, and like how kind of foreign organizations had intervened in that context. And so it didn't necessarily matter, like standing up and saying like, oh, but I'm not working for X organization, like really doesn't matter, because ultimately what it was is that like public health had not responded in a way that was like accepted or helpful to that specific community, and that had left an impact. And so like being mindful of those factors I think is so important, and recognizing like even if it wasn't you still have to account for the fact that you're probably not at a net neutral. Like you probably have caused like in some way, like the idea of public health and like the way in which the field has emerged has possibly caused harm in the past. And so not only do you have to like work to kind of, not only do you have the work to like improve things from that, say like zero mark, but you have to like get to that zero mark, if that makes sense, and like kind of overcome or help like move forward from those historic injustices. So I think that's like framing it that way. I know it's like, it's really challenging and it can feel like kind of, I think, heavy too, because these are really like complex topics. But I think it's really important to kind of frame it that way. And I think that's something that like I hope to bring to public health, and I hope like you all can hopefully bring to public health too as we like move this field forward.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I think that is a really good way to conclude our time together and be able to really have that to sit with. So I just want to say a big thank you for being here with us. When I saw your slides the other day, I knew that this was going to be a wonderful presentation, and it has definitely exceeded my expectations. I have learned a lot, so I'm really appreciative of that. I thank you for your candor. I thank you for your authenticity and just sharing your experiences and your knowledge with us today. So with that, we are going to conclude our first session. Again, thank you so much, Aneeka. The recording will be available later today for anyone that wants to have the opportunity to take a look back at everything.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. You all have a great day.
You too. Bye.
Bye.